Hey everybody, Tim Albrecht here, and thank you for listening to the YFP podcast, where each week we strive to inspire and encourage you on your path towards achieving financial freedom. This week, I welcome back onto the show a familiar voice, Nate Hedrick at the Real Estate RPH and co-host of the YFP Real Estate Investing Podcast. We discuss 5 tips for selling your home, helpful information whether you're looking to sell now or in the future, and even for those looking to buy a home to gain some insights and understandings to what the seller is going through. All right, let's hear from today's sponsor, Real Estate RPH, and then we'll jump into my interview with Nate. Are you planning to buy a home in the next year or two? With the state of current home prices and mortgage rates, the home buying process can feel overwhelming. But what if you could leverage the knowledge and ongoing support of someone who has worked with dozens of other pharmacists through their home buying journey, all at no cost to you? I'm talking about Nate Hedrick at the Real Estate RPH. Nate is a pharmacist who has been a partner of YFP for many years now and offers a home buying concierge service that can help you find a high quality agent in your area and support you throughout the entire process. So head on over to realestaterph.com or click on the link in the show notes to schedule your free 30-minute jumpstart planning session with Nate. Nate, welcome back to the show.
Hey, Tim, always great to be here.
Well, I'm excited to be back in the host seat. Not too long ago on the podcast episode 316, you interviewed Neil and Katie Fox about their journey and lessons learned as first-time homebuyers. What a neat episode that was. And just to recap for our listeners that maybe haven't heard that episode already, tell us about that interview and the story with Neil and Katie.
Yeah, so Neil and Katie were just an awesome couple that I got a chance to work with as home buying concierge clients. So we got them hooked up with an agent, helped them buy their first home together. And it was just really cool to be able to sit down and talk to them about what it's really like to buy a home in this market. We went through kind of everything from A to B or A to Z and just got their perspective on it, right? Somebody that doesn't have experience, right? I sometimes forget how long I've been doing this. And there's things that I don't even think about anymore as like a first-time home buyer. And so to actually talk to first-time home buyers and see where their pitfalls and strategies came from, it was fun. It was really cool to talk to them.
Yeah, great interview. They had some really interesting tidbits, lessons learned, things on financing, importance of working with an agent, who you're working with, and the value of that relationship. So we'll link to that episode in the show notes if folks haven't already heard it. Today, Nate, we're going to be talking about a topic we haven't really covered in depth before. I've lost track. You've been on the show at least 10 times now, maybe more, obviously co-host of the Real Estate Investing Podcast. And we talk so often about buying a home, but we haven't really talked about selling a home. Now, for those that are in the home buying journey and are listening to this and saying, all right, turning this off, they're talking about selling a home, that's not applicable. Hold on, right? Because I think as you and I talked about before the show, as a buyer, if you can really understand some of these tips and components as it relates to the seller, that is going to be helpful to you in the buying journey as well.
Yeah, 100%. Understanding that other side, where the other person's coming from, it's really difficult, especially if you're a first-time home buyer. You have no idea what it's like to sell a home, right? You don't have an idea what it's like to buy a home. And so being able to put yourself in somebody else's shoes as you're going through that journey, it can give you some perspective and it can be really helpful.
Now, before we jump into 5 tips for those that are selling a home, and again, the relevance of that to buyers as well, important to talk about context, right? So we're recording this episode in summer 2023. Wild times just in terms of where the market's at, what's happening with interest rates, where the economy's at. And I do think that context is really important to understand things like leverage, right? As a seller or as a buyer. So Nate, just give us a quick update, knowing that every market is of course different, but you have a unique perspective working with pharmacists and agents all across the country. What are you seeing right now?
Yeah, obviously real estate is local, right? So what I tell you that we're seeing may not be exactly applicable in your area, but broadly what we're seeing is low inventory, right? It's still a seller's market. We have a lot of people who are sitting on 3.5% or lower interest rate loans that they refinanced over the last 3 or 4 years, and they don't want to move if they don't have to, right? So you've got people that want to buy, as there always are, but people that aren't really ready to sell their home yet. And so that's causing a lot of low inventory. We're seeing high prices still, and just things are moving quickly. It's not as crazy as it was in like 2021 and early 22, but it's still an interesting and difficult time if you're a buyer, and a pretty good time if you're a seller in most parts, because you can typically move your houses pretty quickly.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Jess and I often talk about this. We love our home, right? But it's just a natural point of conversation where it's like, wow, what about moving here? What about doing this? And, when you look at what interest rates are doing right now, not only what our interest rate is, right? Refinance close to 3, but seeing what you're going to be buying at, but then also just the elevated prices because of the supply and demand. It's a double whammy effect, right? For
Yeah.
existing home buyers to give up that loan to take on a new higher interest rate loan as well as a higher mortgage on price of the home. So that makes sense what's happening on there on the supply side. And then to be frank, Nate, I'm feeling for the first time home buyers right now, right? Many of them we know in our community are also, facing significant student loan debt. And here we are now ready to have those payments turned back on. And I think that's a topic we just aren't talking enough about. We know from our community, student loans and home buying are for many people two of the top pain points, right? Especially for that new practitioner group. And I think when we look at the rising home prices, rising interest rates, student loan payments turning back on, we're looking at more challenges that I think are being added to this. Doesn't mean it's impossible, right? Doesn't mean it's a goal that can't be attained, but it means we got to be a little bit more diligent in the planning process to make sure we're looking at the broader financial plan.
Yeah, and I appreciate you keeping it at the forefront, because I know if it were me 10 years ago, just starting out dealing with loans, if they were on pause, I don't know, it'd be in that bucket of, well, I'll figure that out when it
I'll
becomes a
figure it
problem,
out.
right? Like I 100% know that would have been me 10 years ago. So
Yeah.
talking about it is super important, because don't wait to figure it out. Start figuring it out now
Yeah.
before it really becomes a problem.
Yeah, and this is where the strategy, we're not going to dig into student loan strategy right now. We've done that many times on the show before, but this is where that strategy part becomes really important, because not all student loan repayment plans are created equal in terms of the impact they have on monthly cash flow. For example, someone who's pursuing loan forgiveness versus someone who's doing an aggressive debt repayment, those are going to have very different impacts on the budget, which obviously is going to change also how much money is available, discretionary income available potentially for a home purchase. So another example yet of where these puzzle pieces need to come together. So let's talk, Nate, 5 tips for those that are selling a home. Number one, not all agents are created equal. I've experienced this in my own home buying journey. And not only that, but also there's the using an agent versus not using an agent for those that are thinking about potentially a for sale by owner. So talk to us about tips as it relates to the agent and why that piece is so important.
Yeah, I think something you mentioned there about the for sale by owner versus an agent. I think a lot of people are they look at the market, they look at how quote unquote easy it is to sell a home, and the first thought becomes, well, can I just do this myself? Right? Couldn't I just kick the agent out of the whole process, save a ton of money on commission? And truthfully, it can be quite a lot, right? Typical way the commission structure works, to peek behind the curtain, right, is that it's going to be about 5 to 6%, depending on the agent that you work with, is what the seller is going to pay toward the commission. And that seller paid commission is what goes to both the buyers and the seller's agent. It's usually split 50-50. So if we say 6%, you're talking about 3% for the buyer's agent, 3% for the seller's agent. And that can be, $18,000 if you're talking about a $300,000 home, which is a huge chunk of change.
Mhm.
So I think it's natural for people to think, man, I can just do this myself. Why bother? I don't want to pay that $18,000. But there's a couple of pieces I think what people should realize before just jumping to that route. Only about 10% of homes in America are sold for sale by owner. And again, there's a reason for that. So one of the stats that I like to throw out there, and it's biased, so I'll lead with that, but that is that according to the National Association of Realtors, and this is looking at 2021, for sale by owner homes sold for about, on average, $225,000 in that year. The typical agent assisted home sale was about $330,000. So about $100,000 difference. Now, again, I think that's biased. I think a lot of for sale by owners tend up being like friends and family. They bring the prices down intentionally in some of those cases, right or wrong. So I think that there's some bias to that number. But let's say that $100,000 number, let's just cut it in a fourth, right? Let's quarter it to $25,000. If you have a $300,000 home, that $25,000 difference is more than the 18 grand we talked about in terms of commission sales. So I still think there's a lot of value there. The typical agent is going to bring a lot more value to the actual home and getting it for the right price, just on a dollar for dollar basis, even if, again, we take that number and cut it in a fourth. So I think that's an important number to look at and to think about, is that the agent is going to be able to bring more value or get more value out of the home on average than you might as a for sale by owner. So then the natural next question to that becomes, well, why? Like, what are they doing that's different? I think a lot of it comes down to just their experience and their ability to price the home appropriately and get the maximum value there. So one of the things that an agent's going to do if you are ready to sell a home, and we can dive into more of these details in a moment, but they're going to come in and they're going to help figure out, here's where I think your house sits today. Here are some things that you could change to improve that value, whether it's curb appeal or decluttering or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And then here's where I think the market value is on that property. Once you know market value, then you can start to come up with strategies for how to price that home.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where an agent's really going to come in, right? Let's say we were going to price it 10,000 under asking, or under market value rather, to try to generate a lot of business. Or let's say we're going to price it right at market value and try to get the most dollars we can for it right up front. There are a lot of different things that go into that strategy that I think an agent brings to the table that a typical home seller might just not have access to that information or be aware of. And then if you go beyond the dollar amount, I think that's where the agent comes in with paperwork and helping with all the legal paperwork. There's a lot of legality that goes into home sales. And a lot of this, a title agent or a good lawyer can help you with. Mm-hmm. But the agent takes all the guesswork out of that, right? Yep. Everything's been predetermined, pre-established by a broker. It's all going to be put in front of you in the way that it needs to be. And there's a lot of value that can be created from that.
Yeah, the other thing too here, Nate, great points that stand out to me would just be peace of mind, right? Knowing that there's coordination, assuming, and we'll talk here in a moment about why all agents are not created equal. Here we're talking about agent versus for sale by owner. Mm-hmm. Peace of mind, assuming you've got the right person on your team, right? That's coordinating all of these, but also time. I've gone down this pathway and I don't think I would do it again, to be frank. And I think even though, it was someone within the neighborhood and it was a pretty easy process, there was a lot of those questions about pricing it appropriately. And is this fair, right? And now you're not dealing with kind of what is the market say the home's worth, but it gets more emotional when it's just one party with another party, right? Is this fair between, two parties? But then just the time and the coordination, the title, and there's this lingering feeling of like, is everything being done correctly mm-hmm. and coordinated? And I remember maybe part of that is just my type A personality a little bit as well. But this is a podcast of busy healthcare professionals. Right. Like I think they can appreciate, especially if the ROI is there, as you mentioned, how important it could be to really make sure that you've got someone in your corner. Now, that's an obvious one. I think for many would be the agent versus the for sale by owner, especially considering folks are busy. But again, not all agents are created equal.
Right.
And I think this is interesting, right? We talk about this a lot on the show about financial planners. And I think we've done a really good job highlighting how the term financial planner in and of itself doesn't mean a whole lot. Now there's so much variance between planners in terms of credentials and experience and how they charge and transparency. I don't think we give the same diligence to real estate agents. Mm-hmm. And I don't know why, but the more I started to think about this, I'm like, wow, this is really interesting. Like experience matters a lot. Somebody understanding my local market matters. Connections, right? Someone who can, you shared before we hit record about an example of a deal you were working on where some pretty simple work needed to be done and you're able to line up a contractor and move that forward. That matters, those relationships. So talk to us about why the right agent matters and how do people vet this? How do they find that?
Yeah, it's certainly tricky. And I think what most people do, I'll tell you what most people do, and I'll tell you what I'd recommend, right? So what most people focus on is the commission, right? They want to find out how they can get this done for as cheap as possible
like an interest rate on a mortgage, right?
Right, exactly. Yeah. Okay, I want the guy that's 5.5%, not the guy that's 6%, right? So people focus heavily on that. And again, in the grand scheme of things, that 1% difference that you might find across the market, that's not where your focus should be. But that's what a lot of people like to focus on. The other thing to focus on is when you do a listing presentation, when I present to a seller and say, look, this is what I'm going to do for you, they're really focused on the number. Well, what do you think you can sell my house for? And I'll tell you, there's only so much an agent truly can do with the home that's in front of them, right? The same home, the same parameters, different agents are not going to be able to sell that house for more, just being upfront. What a good agent's going to do is come in and tell you, here's how to maximize the value of your home. Here's how I can sell it for more. Not, here's the same house as the next agent's going to be selling. We're not changing anything. they're not going to ink more value out of that house just by being a quote unquote better agent, right? What a great agent is going to do is come in and say, look, if you declutter this a little bit, if I let you borrow this storage unit that I have specifically for my sellers, we get a couple of these pieces of extra furniture out of here. We take down some of the pictures. Here are the things that we're going to do. That's how you're going to maximize value. So
Yeah.
when I'm talking to a client, and what I recommend, everybody do out there, if you're interviewing a seller's agent, talk about what are the things that you're going to do to maximize the value of my home, not how can you sell this for as much money as possible.
Yeah.
And those are closely related to the same question, but they're not the same question.
Yeah, future episode, I just took a note. We should do a future episode on questions that you should ask, right, when hiring an agent. I think that's a really good one to consider. Well, in your experience working with other agents, but also in your own experience as a realtor selling homes, what are some ways that you've either stood out? I mean, experience, let's say that's a given, or that you've seen other agents stand out?
Yeah. So I think there are a lot of like big ticket things that people stand out with that are like attention grabbers. The one I mentioned was like the storage unit. I've seen agents that will offer like those pods. They'll say, look, if you sell with me, I will give you a pod to put all your extra furniture in, to put that in storage for a while we sell the home, right? There's definitely some value to that. I've seen agents offer staging. So especially if the home is vacant, or if you're in the process of moving out and things are kind of, hodgepodge, you can have the home staged, and that can be really advantageous. And some agents will offer that as a big incentive. I've also seen a lot of, this is pretty common on billboards with like big ticket, high volume agents. Well, they'll offer a guarantee, right? We'll list your home, and if it doesn't sell in a month, then we guarantee we'll buy it from you. And there are a lot of stipulations to that, but I've seen that as kind of a big ticket thing. I'll tell you where I try to offer value. Again, these are things that I might pepper in where it makes sense, but most sellers actually don't need a lot of those services, quite frankly. I try to just make things as easy as possible. You mentioned earlier, if you're a busy working professional, if you want to hire an agent, you're doing so because you want to take all the guesswork out of it and all the legwork out of it, right? It should be as painless as it possibly can be. So that's what I try to come in and show them how I'm going to be able to do that. And that's what I encourage other sellers to look for when you're talking to a good agent.
Yeah, and I think, Nate, the huge advantage that you have, the relationship piece, asking good questions. You're a pharmacist that has gone down the path of a first-time home buyer. You've obviously worked with, many individuals. You understand what it means to buy a home when you have student loans and the considerations. And, certainly it's not financial planning, right? But it's being able to ask good questions that really help people self-reflect and understand, and not just like, yep, I'm ready to sell your home, right? Whether or not that's maybe in their best interest. So
even if it's something as simple as, hey, you want to sell your home, and what's more important, getting every single dollar we can out of it, or closing in the next 30 or 40 days so that we can move into the next place or whatever.
What's the goal?
Just a simple question about like, what's the goal of getting this home sold, right? Is it just to move it as quickly as possible, or is it to maximize value, and starting from there?
Great stuff. So that's number one on our 5 tips for selling a home. Not all agents are created equal. Number 2, you alluded to this a little bit already, but I want to dig deeper. And that's really in terms of determining what is or not worth it, right? Upgrades, repairs, boosting curb appeal, staging the home, right? Maximizing the value of what someone may be able to get out of the home is what you mentioned just a few moments ago. So what tips do you have here for sellers?
Yeah, this is something where a good agent can really make themselves worth it, right? Because there is a ton of stuff. I like look around my house today and think like, man, if I was going to sell it, I have to fix that, and I got to paint that, and so there quickly becomes this list of stuff that you could do before selling a house. And what's the ROI on that? A great agent is going to know the local market, is going to know the comparable properties that have sold recently, and is going to be able to see what those high value items are that you should focus on, and what those low value negative ROI things are that you could just ignore, right? There's always going to be stuff to fix on a house. The trick is finding the things that you can do now that are going to be not very labor intensive and are going to maximize the overall value and the speed with which we can sell that property. So it's a myriad of items. It varies based on the home itself. But generally speaking, you're looking for things where if I don't fix this, is it going to prevent somebody from making an offer, right? That's a really common one, right? Let's say the roof is actively leaking. A lot of people are not going to be interested in jumping into a $10,000 or $20,000 fix right off the bat. Yeah. So those are kind of things that are sort of obvious that, hey, if I fix this, yeah, my ROI might not be huge, but it's going to make people want to offer, whereas they may have not previously. So thinking about things like that And then also thinking about things that, hey, if other homes in the area that have a deck, for example, like a back patio or a deck, all of the deck houses are selling twice as fast as all the houses that don't have a deck, right? And you're in a very similar community. That might be something that's worthwhile putting in,
Mhm.
right? Especially if you've got like a sliding door already out there and it's ready to go, it's just begging for a deck. That might be an easy ROI item that you could tack on. It's going to be high cost, but it might make that that home sell for that much more. So it's those kind of things that a really good agent's going to be able to jump in and give you advice on to make sure that you can maximize that value.
Yeah, and that's a great example with the deck, right? Because I think about, again, if we put ourselves in the buyer's shoes, like all
Hmm.
of a sudden I see the home as having a new outdoor living space.
Right.
And maybe it's not all the way there, but you're providing vision, right? For somebody to come in and say, whoa, wow, like I've got maybe smaller square footage home, or maybe it
Right.
doesn't have all the bells and whistles that I wanted, but like I can really see how I could use this space differently. So great insights there. I think that's just so important. And again, putting yourself in the buyer's shoes, what the roof example, the deck example, especially first time home buyers, are not coming with a bunch of cash sitting in the bank
Yep.
to do some of these things, right? Minor upgrades, minor improvements, but things that you can do. And obviously the question is there an ROI there or not, is really going to be helpful, to those buyers. I also think, Nate, I'd be curious to hear your perspective here. Where you're at in terms of price point of the neighborhood, I think could be really important here on potential ROI, right? So if
Yep.
I am the biggest house, the most expensive house in the neighborhood already, and I add a $10,000 deck, hoping I can raise the price $20,000, like maybe not as much if on the low end. Is that fair?
Yeah, it's spot on, right? And again, that's where a good agent's going to be able to come in and say, look, here are the comparable properties that have sold. This is
Yeah.
what people are going to be looking at. Or better yet, one of my favorite things to do is to look at what else is on the market today. So if I've got a $300,000 home and there are three other $300,000 homes for sale in the same
Hmm.
community, how am I differentiating? How am I, I don't need to undercut them by $5,000 and just be the cheapest game in town, but I also can't be $30,000
Yes.
more and expect to be the first one that everybody buys, right? Unless there's
Hmm.
some sort of real big value item that I'm bringing that's different than those other homes. So that's where an agent can come in and really try to help that out.
Great stuff. Number 3 on our list, why it matters to depersonalize or neutralize the home. This gets a little bit to what we were talking about, wanting the buyer to really have a vision of their own. And
Mhm.
I know this is something that you hear all the time, you read about, but as a buyer myself going through the process twice, I was amazed at how often this wasn't done. So tell us about why this is important and what this may look like.
Yeah, and I think everybody kind of gets you get really comfortable in your own home, right? You know what you like, you're used to it. You think it's perfect because you live there. Why wouldn't you, right? It's a natural thing to do. I think it's easy to miss some of the stuff that might come across to a buyer as making it feel like not welcoming. And that might be something that to you again is very welcoming. Family photos, all the
Hmm.
furniture that you love, the beat up chair that you love to sit in every night before going to bed, right? Like that's your spot. I get it. But somebody else walking in might look at that and go, "Oh my god, that like it's been scratched by the
Hmm.
cat for 20 years. This looks horrible." Right? So you have to be able to kind of put perspective on that. Is if you were a total neutral party walking into that home and trying to envision it as the place they want to live,
Yeah.
you have to be able to reset that. And so one of the ways that I encourage sellers to do that is to really try to neutralize things like you mentioned, neutralize the home to aware that they can see that it's someone living there, it's comfortable, it's a place they want to be, but it doesn't feel like it's not their space yet. They can
Hmm.
start to envision themselves in that space because it's not so personalized or so specific to one individual.
Yeah, so I think these are, I think of things like paint and photos and odors in the home, right?
Yeah.
Good, bad, indifferent. And you gave some great examples, like the chair, that we like to sit on at night. And some of these, what's great about this is it's not wildly expensive, typically, right? Like neutralizing paint colors. But I have vivid memories of going into houses where it was like red carpet, lime green walls, and it's like, man, that is such an easy, or dark paint that made a
Right.
room look smaller. You know, minuscule changes in light fixtures and other things that can really open up a room and make it look bigger.
And you mentioned smells too. Like you hit the nail on the head with things that are unique can be the problem, right? Maybe it's an air freshener you have that you love, and it's like tropical oasis or whatever. And it's just
In
like
your face.
pineapple when you walk in or whatever, right? Like that stuff can be just as bad, even though it smells good.
Yeah,
Like it
that's
can be
right.
just as off-putting to somebody. I'll give you a great example. I had a client that was real sensitive to candles, and we
Yep.
would go into any house, even if it smelled phenomenal to me, she would immediately say like, "Oh, I can't. I feel like I'm getting a migraine. Like this is
Yes.
driving me crazy." Yes, it's a good smell, but it's not helping your case. So it's all about neutral, and that's the way you're going to maximize that potential value, and the people walking in and out of your home are going to have a good experience.
I like that. So that was number 3, why it matters to depersonalize, why it matters to neutralize the home. Number 4 is setting the price. I'm really curious, Nate. I have not yet gone through the buying or selling process in this chaotic market that we live in. And just curious of what you're seeing in terms of, pricing lower to try to, generate more interest. Maybe you have somewhat of a bidding war, pricing it a little bit higher because of the market and where things are at. Again, all markets being local. What are your thoughts here?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing here, and I tell this to every single client I work with, the list price of a home is completely made up. The market value of the home is the number you want to determine, right? We are all pharmacists here. We're all interested in like facts and numbers, right? I don't want to just make things up. That's why you want to determine market value first and adjust from there, right?
Yeah.
So a good agent's going to come in and tell you, look, this is the market value of their home. It's between $340,000 and $350,000. They should be able to give you a pretty tight range. And here are the factors that I'm basing that on. If I were to list your home today, here's the pricing strategy I would use. And like you said, it can be anything from listing it at that 340 or 335 mark to try to generate a lot of activity. Typically, we're going to do that if there are many other homes on the market, right? That's more typical in a neutral market or a buyer's market, where I want to be the first one of the 5 that are available that people go see. And the reason they're doing that is because it's priced lower than everything else, right? I'm still going to get close to market value for it, but I'm going to be the first one that everybody looks at, especially.
Yeah, think of the filters, right? On Realtor, Redfin,
exactly.
Or filtering by price.
Yeah. Exactly. The other strategy is, hey, if there's nothing available, if you're in a market like the community that I live in, where a home goes on the market and it sells in 2 days because everybody wants to buy and there's not enough inventory, you can push that market value quite a bit, right? If we determine that it's 340 to 350, I might list it 375 and see what happens, right? You might get a bite at that price. And as long as it appraises, awesome. Like you've gotten more than market value out of your home, but you have to start with what is the market value before you can determine a strategy. So many agents, I hear this all the time from prospective sellers, they will just throw these giant numbers at people. They won't tell them market value. They say, well, if I were to list your home today, I'd list it for $400,000. Well, why? Just because it's the biggest number and you want me to work with you? Or do you have a real reason behind that, right? And that's the kind of questions you want to be asking.
So since you brought up appraisals, I want to talk about that for a moment, because in my experience, it feels like appraisals are a little bit like the wild, wild west,
100%.
And just a ton of subjectivity. And I know that's supposed to, have been tightening up, and I don't know, it just feels like it hasn't when you think about the process and how it's completed. What are you seeing? Again, small sample size in your area, but what are you seeing in terms of, for people that are pushing price point that maybe is X% above market value? Like, how tight is the appraisal to the market value right now?
Yeah, appraisals unfortunately are just still so subjective. Typically what I'm seeing is that if you get a home that is over market value, but there are multiple offers on that home, the appraiser is kind of at the point where, and again, this is not actually how they work, but what it feels like is that they're looking at it and saying, look, this is an arm's length transaction. That's a real estate word for basically it's on the market and anybody can buy it. This is an arm's length transaction and there are multiple people interested at 380. And it's probably worth 380, right? If lots of people want it, I don't have
becomes the market value.
I don't have empiric evidence to say it's worth more than 350, but I do have 6 people who all threw an offer at this house at 380 and near it. So maybe that is the value, right? I don't think that's actually how appraisers are doing it, but that's how it feels. Yeah. They're supposed to base it on comps. They're supposed to base it on recent home sales. Ideally, it's based on homes within a mile or less radius, really even less than half a mile, and within the last 6 months. There is certainly times where it doesn't feel like that's being followed, good or bad, right? Negative or positive. They're picking other homes or whatever, but that's the ideal state. Yeah. It's also a tough job. Not every home is built the exact same way, right? You don't have just the same cookie cutter house across every block. So it's not an easy way to determine. Yeah. So that can make it difficult.
Yeah, that's a good point, right? We all know that a 4-bedroom, 2,000 square foot homes can be very different.
Absolutely.
So if you're just looking at kind of those bones for comps, it may not be a fair comparison. And I've been in those situations where you're in areas that aren't as populated and they're trying to draw in comps within a reasonable geographic range. And you just know like, that's so different, right? Now, If you're in an area where you've got multiple subdivisions and kind of the same type of home, and thousands of them, maybe that's not,
Yeah.
as significant of a difference. All right, number 5 on our list of tips for sellers is understanding buyer versus seller costs and who is typically paying for what. Tell us more, Nate.
Yeah, so this is a big point of when you get a house, when someone's actually buying your home and get it under contract, there's going to be a lot of negotiations about who's paying for what. And this can be state specific. Some states lay out exactly how it's supposed to be, and then you can deviate from that. Others are just up in the air, right? You determine what's normal for your market.
Mm-hmm.
And so it can be everything from the taxes, right? How are you splitting the taxes? It can be the title fees. So the actual process of transferring that title, who's paying for that? Typically it would be split 50-50, but maybe, in this market, you want the buyer to cover everything or whatever, right? That's all part of the negotiation. There are some things that I think typically fall on one side or the other. So things like inspections typically fall on the buyer. I can't think of a single transaction I've ever done where the seller helped to cover inspection fees, but I suppose it's out there. And then closing costs. Closing costs are usually split, except for the buyer specific stuff like down payment and rate lock fees and all the other stuff. So there are a lot of different ways you can slice that up, but typically things are cut 50-50, and then anything that's very buyer centric is going to be covered by the buyer and vice versa. Mm-hmm. So that's what I typically see, but you can certainly build it any way you like.
So we were talking before the show, that's all when things go as planned, right? But there's situations where once someone's under contract and then a problem's identified, right? Typically under inspection or, something else comes up, major, right? Septic tank, roof, types of things. Tell us about your experiences here and how that may impact this item.
Yeah. So one of the items that typically comes up is a seller's credit, is what it's called. And typically if you are selling a home, you might be providing some sort of credit back to the buyer. The most common version of that is what's called a closing cost credit, where you're basically saying, here, I'm going to give you $3,000 toward your closing costs to help you with some of the cash that you're going to need to buy the house. What I often will see is somebody that says, hey, look, if the house is listed at $340 and we're close on and we're negotiating down to $335, maybe we can agree on $340, but you give me $5,000 back in the form of closing cost credit. That will reduce the cash that I need as a buyer. The seller still makes the same amount, right? The net value is still $335, but it's helping the buyer out quite a bit. That's very common. But what you mentioned, where we've got a problem that might come up down the road, or someone's trying to push that seller's credit beyond the typical amount, that's where you can start to get into some issues. I had a deal a couple of years ago. I was actually representing the buyer, and during inspection, we determined that the house needed a new septic tank. And it was way out in the woods. It was a 5-bedroom home. It was pretty large. It needed a huge old septic tank dug out, new one put in, $10,000 fix, easy. Oh. Yeah. So it became a question of well, how do we do that? When do we do that? Right? Is it before closing? Is it during, after? What does that look like? And there are a lot of different ways that you can build that in. For this particular deal, what we ultimately determined was we had 2 companies come out, give quotes. We basically all agreed that this was the company we were going to go with. Buyer and seller agreed to that. And the seller provided a $10,000 credit toward that septic system to be installed, after closing. There are certainly risks to the buyer to doing that. There are risks to the seller to doing that, but it was what we landed on. So it's something where if and when those problems come up, you want to talk to your agent about, hey, what does this look like? If I do X, what are the ramifications? If we do Y, what are the outcomes? And then you can make the best possible determination. But there are lots of different ways that you can build that.
Great stuff. Another example, right, where a good agent with experience really comes in, right? Hey, I've been through this scenario. I've seen how this is done, or multiple ways this has been done. So seeing how all of these tie together. Well, there you have it. 5 tips for those that are selling a home, and also for things to be aware of, those that are buying a home, and to have the helpful insights. Nate, as always, really appreciate your time, your insights, your expertise, and for coming on the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Tim.
Nate and I have covered a ton of information in this podcast. So imagine working with Nate one-on-one through your home buying journey and having his support to give you much needed peace of mind. We know many pharmacists want to feel confident about big financial decisions, including a home purchase. So if you have fears of being house poor or concerns about the impact a home purchase might have on your other financial goals, Nate and his home buying concierge service can help, all at no cost to you. You can visit realestaterph.com or click on the link in the show notes to schedule your free 30-minute jumpstart planning session with Nate. As we conclude this week's podcast, an important reminder that the content on this show is provided to you for informational purposes only and is not intended to provide and should not be relied on for investment or any other advice. Information in the podcast and corresponding materials should not be construed as a solicitation or offer to buy or sell any investment or related financial products. We urge listeners to consult with a financial advisor with respect to any investment. Furthermore, the information contained in our archived newsletters, blog posts, and podcasts is not updated and may not be accurate at the time you listen to it on the podcast. Opinions and analyses expressed herein are solely those of your financial pharmacist unless otherwise noted, and constitute judgments as of the dates published. Such information may contain forward-looking statements which are not intended to be guarantees of future events. Actual results could differ materially from those anticipated in the forward-looking statements. For more information, please visit yourfinancialpharmacist.com/disclaimer. Thank you again for your support of the Your Financial Pharmacist podcast. Have a great rest of your week.